My grandma left her church 1 cent in her will, then dropped the ultimate bombshell. My grandmother was a lifelong member of a large conservative Christian church. This church, which I'll call Big White Church, was part of a major evangelical domination. Big White Church was located in a thriving suburb of a large city in the southern United States. My grandmother was an incredibly active member of Big White Church. Every Sunday morning, she worked in the church nursery, helped prepare hundreds of breakfasts and dinners for the congregation, accompanied her children and grandchildren on dozens of church trips and choir tours, led a youth Bible study on Sunday evenings, actively participated in missionary work, and assisted with other youth programs. She always tithed and often gave beyond that for missions and special offerings. My grandmother had a gift. She could make others feel important. I witnessed this many times myself, even though I attended a different church. I often visited my grandmother and joined her at Big White Church events. I saw her single-handedly prepare breakfast for dozens of church teens, a task that took over 2 hours, even in the church's massive kitchen. Afterward, she'd ask everyone to applaud the high schooler who helped organize the prayer breakfast, saying, "He did such a great job." I remember one youth trip to a church camp when my grandmother drove nearly all night back to the city to retrieve a box of evangelistic materials, forgotten by one of the pastor's assistants. Let's call him the assistant. He asked her to bring them for the morning session. His boss, the senior pastor, never found out the assistant messed up and my grandmother fixed it. The assistant didn't even thank her. Though I was just a kid, it really upset me, and I asked her why she agreed to do it. She said it didn't bother her, and her reward was knowing those materials would help the kids find Jesus. Her work at the church came to an abrupt end at age 73 when she injured her spine in a car accident. For the last 10 years of her life, she was homebound, unable to attend church due to the injury and her declining health with age. Her mind remained sharp, her faith sincere, but her body failed her more each day. During those 10 years, she repeatedly tried to stay connected with her church, its leadership, and her friends in the congregation. She invited them to visit her at home, but to no avail. Every invitation was either declined or ignored. Near the end, when she was receiving palliative care at home, my grandmother decided to plan her own funeral. She and my grandfather called the church and asked for the senior pastor, whom she had known for over 30 years, to visit. They wanted the memorial service to be held at the church and planned to discuss it with him, but the senior pastor was too busy, and the assistant came by a few days later instead. According to my grandfather, here's how that visit went. With my grandmother literally on her deathbed, the three of them, my grandmother, grandfather, and the assistant, talked about the funeral for a couple of minutes. Then the assistant began pressuring her to store up treasures in heaven and not forget her church and her will. My grandfather firmly told him, now is not the time or place to discuss her will. They briefly returned to discussing the funeral, but the assistant steered the conversation back to her will, adding lengthy remarks about how much her church needed her support. My grandfather reiterated several times that talking about her will and the church's financial needs was inappropriate, especially given the severe physical pain she was in. The assistant seemed to agree and returned to funeral details, but he kept circling back to money, heavenly rewards, and quoting, "For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." Matthew 6. My grandmother broke down in tears. To be clear, my grandmother wasn't just a strong woman, she was a titanium pillar coated in diamond and wrapped in Kevlar. She almost never cried, and certainly never for herself. Not a single tear fell when the doctor told her that her spine was so damaged she'd never walk again, nor during the 6 months of fruitless rehabilitation that followed. At funerals or hospital visits, with family receiving bad news, she might cry sincerely but quietly to comfort others. Weep with those who weep, but neither my grandfather, her daughter, my mom, my uncle, nor my grandmother's siblings could recall her ever crying for herself. Yet there she was, sobbing uncontrollably. My grandfather, a former steelworker, retired Marine Corps sergeant, and Korean War veteran, grabbed the assistant and physically threw him out of their home. Not exactly gently. Against all odds, my grandmother lived another 6 months, sustained purely by willpower. In the end, she passed away, and we held her memorial service at a funeral home, not at Big White Church. The senior pastor and the assistant were conspicuously absent. Moreover, not a single member of the clergy from Big White Church was present, not in the room, not on the stage, nowhere. At the start of the memorial service, my grandfather stepped up to the podium and addressed the gathering. "Some of you may have heard that I didn't invite the senior pastor or the assistant to this service," he said. I don't think now is the time or place to explain my reasons. But you all know me, and you know I had good reasons. Besides, my wife specifically asked me not to invite them. This memorial will be different from others you may have attended. It'll be an open mic service. Anyone who wants can come up, share a story about their friendship with my wife, recall a memory worth preserving, or say something to honor her, and bring comfort to everyone here today. I've asked a few family members to prepare remarks, but it's not required. If you feel moved to speak, come up and share. About 100 people attended the funeral. At least a third of them ended up speaking at the mic. The service, originally planned for half an hour, lasted over 2 hours. As far as I know, no one left early. There was laughter, tears, and hugs. 3 of my cousins played her favorite songs on the piano and guitar, and we all held hands and sang them together. After the ceremony, dozens of people told my grandfather it was one of the most moving and heartfelt funerals they'd ever attended. Many added, "Funerals without pastors are better," or something along those lines. A couple of weeks later, it was time to distribute my grandmother's estate, according to her will. Though my grandparents loved each other deeply, they had separate wills. As my grandmother explained to my mom, it was easier to respect each other's boundaries that way, and their lawyer had recommended it. No one thought they had significant wealth. They'd lived in the same modest, cozy house in a nice suburb for over 50 years, worked hard and led a frugal lifestyle, but rumors suggested they had substantial savings. There's no legal obligation to attend a will reading, and in modern times, it's become rare due to widespread literacy and communication tools. But in our family, will readings were a tradition, a rare occasion, when our large, close-knit family came together. We didn't have family reunions. They were too hard to organize with such a big family. Instead, we gathered for birthdays, holidays, and funerals. Attending a few of these events meant you'd see nearly all your cousins, aunts, uncles, great-aunts, great-uncles, and even my grandparents' siblings. Given this tradition, our family's wills often included deeply personal gifts with little monetary value, but served as a way to pass on warm memories or a piece of the heart to loved ones. My grandfather also hinted that my grandmother's will contained surprises, and family gossip spread the word. The reading took place in a law firm's conference room. As expected, my mom, aunts, uncles, cousins, and many grandchildren were there. What truly surprised us was the presence of the senior pastor and the assistant from Big White Church. They announced that my grandmother's lawyer had informed them her will included not only a donation to the church but also personal gifts for both of them. Maybe it was just our imagination, but to me, my siblings, and my cousins, it was hard not to notice. The two of them seemed practically salivating at the prospect of my grandmother's generosity. My grandmother had a large family, so the will named quite a few heirs. The law firm's conference room was slightly smaller than a typical middle-class living room. Extra chairs were brought in, every seat was taken, and the remaining space was filled with people standing. The room barely fit us all. My grandmother's lawyer suggested seating the senior pastor and the assistant next to him. Since there was a large table in the room, this meant the lawyer and both pastors sat facing everyone else. The pastors seemed flattered to be at the center of attention, but didn't notice, unlike the rest of us, that these seats allowed everyone to closely observe them. It also made it nearly impossible for them to reach the door without disrupting the meeting. They were seated farthest from the exit, with about 24 people between them and the door. The estate was generous but largely as expected. My grandfather inherited their house, its contents, their retirement savings, and everything left after the other gifts were distributed. My parents, aunts, uncles, grandchildren, and a few local charities received nice, though not extravagant sums. Some sentimental items were given to friends and relatives. The will listed my grandfather first, followed by the other beneficiaries in order of the gifts' increasing value. It started with sentimental items of little monetary worth, then each grandchild received a few $1,000s. Next, slightly larger sums went to each son, daughter, brother, sister, nephew, and niece. After that, several local charities received substantial amounts, and so on. The bequests to Big White Church, the senior pastor, and the assistant were near the very end of the list. They listened politely to everything before, but with growing impatience, especially as they noticed the increasing generosity of my grandmother's gifts with each line read. When the lawyer reached the section concerning Big White Church and the pastors, he said, "This is a bit unusual, but before I announce the bequeathed amounts for Big White Church, the senior pastor and the assistant, Mrs. Grandmother's name, requested that I read the following letter to everyone present. He opened a letter written in my grandmother's handwriting. For the last 10 years, not a single person from Big White Church called me, visited me, or sent so much as a note to say they remembered me. Not one pastor, not one deacon, not one woman from the church, not one of the congregants I worked with for years, loved sincerely, and considered friends. I labored diligently for you all when you needed me, but when I needed you in my church, you acted as if I didn't exist. The only visit I received was when I was dying, and invited the senior pastor to my home to help plan my funeral. It was my final attempt, after countless efforts over the last 10 years, to reconnect with my church and the pastor I still deeply loved, despite their clear message that they didn't love me. I hoped that if I could arrange a funeral at the church, maybe some of my old friends from the congregation, whom I hadn't seen in a decade, would come to say goodbye. I knew how much they loved hearing the senior pastor's sermon. If he spoke at my memorial, maybe they'd come for that, even if they wouldn't come for me. But the senior pastor didn't even have time to call and confirm whether he'd officiate. The assistant did visit, but he didn't talk about the funeral. He only wanted me to remember his church in my will. That's it. Just remember the church in your will. And then I realized I had let my church break my heart for the last time. But it was the very last time. The assistant didn't know that when he visited, my husband and I had already finalized my will. Back then it did include a double tithe, 20% of my entire estate, for the church that was once mine, but is now my former church, Big White Church. That amount was the sum was named, an absolutely staggering sum of money. This caused a muffled wow from many heirs, including me. The letter continued. But then I felt uneasy that we hadn't named such wonderful people as the senior pastor and the assistant specifically, so I revised my will to include them by name. At the same time, I adjusted the amount bequeathed to Big White Church to reflect all the love they showed me over the last 10 years of my life, when I was suffering, lonely, and could no longer work for them for free as I had for nearly half a century. That's all she wrote, the lawyer said. Now back to the distribution of the estate per the will. To the senior pastor 1 cent. To the assistant, 1 cent. To Big White Church 1 cent. The senior pastor and the assistant sat there with faces as if they'd both been injected with a full dose of Novocaine in their jaws. Every relative and friend of my grandmother felt an overwhelming urge to burst out laughing, but we held it in. We knew my grandmother, and we knew this wasn't the end. She was just setting the stage for the real blow. The best was yet to come, and we didn't want to miss it. There's one more bequest, the lawyer continued, to a charitable organization. He named it, but I'll call it Black Charity. He paused before announcing the amount. Most of us had no idea what this organization was, but the looks on the senior pastors' and assistants' faces made it clear they knew Black Charity very well. Their expressions showed shock, horror, and panic, as if the lawyer had just said, "This donation is for demonic child eaters, to buy giant grills and tons of charcoal for a barbecue." All eyes in the room turned to the pastor. The lawyer, who also happened to be my uncle, one of my grandparents' sons, let the pause linger a few seconds longer. If we could have read the pastors' minds, we'd have understood why they looked so stricken. Black Charity was a charitable organization, tied to a large black church, just a few miles from Big White Church. They provided free food and clothing, support for foster children, meal deliveries for the elderly, legal aid, and other social programs. Years ago, Big White Church, which was and still is a 100% white, had provided financial and other support to Black Charity for a time. But then came a deeply painful and messy fallout, supposedly because Black Charity preached a social gospel, while Big White Church preached the true gospel. Big White Church even sued Black Charity to reclaim some of the funds, though the matter was eventually settled. But since this was the southern U.S., everyone knew the real reason. Big White Church, like many white churches, stopped supporting Black Charity. My grandparents had seriously considered leaving Big White Church back then, but decided to stay and preach tolerance through their words and example. They knew they couldn't change everyone, but they hoped to reach the younger members of their white church and break the multi-generational cycle of racism. My grandmother always told us, "My church is my mission field." We only grasped the true meaning of those words after her death. Since that fallout, my grandparents had secretly donated part of their tithe to Black Charity every month. Most of our family, including me, only learned about this after the meeting ended. But the senior pastor and the assistant undoubtedly understood exactly what my grandmother was saying, not with words, but with actions that spoke louder than any words. If you grew up in the South and were white, you'd get it too. The message was clear. These people you despise and oppress are better than you, and they're the ones who deserve my money, not you. After enough time had passed for everyone in the room to observe the pastor's faces as they processed how they and their church had treated my grandmother, the lawyer said, "The amount is." He then announced the exact same staggering sum mentioned in my grandmother's letter, the amount that would have gone to Big White Church had she not revised her will. And that's the end of the story. Thanks for sticking with it until the end. Be sure to let me know what you think in the comments. Also, check out our previous video, which you'll see right here. And good luck to you all.